We're going to start first by modifying our shifter, and the beginning of this video is going to pertain to the X01, X1, and GX shifters. The tools that you'll need to do this are the T25 Torx tool, 2.5, 3, and 4 millimeter Allen wrenches. The parts that you'll need are the GX shifter ratchet and spool, the pivot bolt, washer, and then this tool which we call the claw. So let's get started. So the first thing you'll want to do is release the tension in the spring if there is any. Okay, and now we're good to remove the cover. With the 3 millimeter Allen, pull this bolt, set the bolt and the cover aside. And now we're going to flip this shifter over, and this is where you can first see these bolts right here. This is sort of holding the whole shifter together, and you'll see that the claw actually matches up with those 3 bolts. Now on the X01 shifters, you can actually remove the lever, and you're going to have to because this bolt interferes with the claw, and that becomes a problem later. So we're going to go ahead and remove this lever now. Okay, now you can see that the claw matches up with the bolts, free of any obstruction, and we can take our 2.5 millimeter Allen wrench and pull these bolts. So when you're removing these bolts, make sure that you are pinching the shifter body with your hand to keep everything from coming apart, and set these bolts aside somewhere where you can reach them because we're about to reinstall them. Now flip the shifter body over. We're going to remove this plastic cover. Set that aside. Now we've exposed the internals of the shifter. So as you can see, I'm holding this shifter together because the bolts are removed. And now we're going to place the claw over the bolt holes and reinstall the bolts into the claw. So the claw basically holds everything together while we swap out the spool here in a little bit. And you don't have to torque these bolts at all. You can just sort of thread them in until they bottom out. One of these bolts is shorter than the other, and the short one will go through this hole that's completely covered with metal here. As you can see, the other holes with the longer screws go in don't actually go through any of the metal, so that's a good way to keep track of which goes where. Okay, now we have the claw successfully installed, and we can remove the spring to expose the spool. Okay, so now we're going to unscrew the pivot bolt, which is this 4 millimeter right here. This is what keeps the ratchet and spool and the rest of the shifter body together. The first thing we have to do is flip the shifter over and put the T25 here in the bottom through the claw. And then we're going to take our 4 millimeter, put it into the pivot bolt. Okay, so this part can be kind of tricky because there's a few bearings pressed in here on either side. So what we're going to want to do is, with the T25 hooked up and the 4 millimeter on top of the pivot bolt over here, we're going to want to unthread and make sure that we are watching the pivot bolt come out here on the left and applying more pressure on the right so that everything sort of moves outward toward the spool rather than pushing the T25 bolt out into the claw. You'll see what I mean here in just a second. There's a little bit of knurling on this pivot bolt, so it sort of bumps as you turn, but you can just power through that. Okay, we can see the spool starting to come off. That's all good. Okay. All right, so we've got the pivot bolt here, and that bearing came out, but we can just go ahead and slide that off the pivot bolt and pop it back into the spool, no problem. Okay, so set this aside if you ever want to go back and make your shifter 11 speed again, but this whole unit is going to be removed. Okay, so now we're going to take our E13 ratchet and spool, and we're going to install the washer here on the bottom. After a light greasing, everything should stick pretty easily. So the washer goes right there on the ratchet, and then the E13 pivot bolt goes in through the top of the spool. Sort of thread them together like this. Make sure everything's snug, and we can drop this back onto the shifter body. Notice the metal pawl in the image on the left. You're going to need to align the window on the black plastic spool with that pawl when you install it. So the image on the right, you can kind of see the metal pawl through the window. That lets you know that the spool is aligned correctly, and you're safe to install the pivot bolt now. Okay, there's a little bit of a technique here. You'll want this spool sort of fully clocked in the relaxed position, which is at the end of the teeth here. You're going to need to bump this thing a little bit. This whole arm here sort of springs forward and everything falls into place. So, okay, that looks good. Everything's stacked. All right, now we can thread this bolt back in. Take your 4mm and your T25. Go ahead and thread. Okay, so now the pivot bolt is secure, so we can go ahead and remove the claw. Again, that's the 2.5mm Allen. All right, now when we pull this thing, we want to be careful not to let anything come apart. Okay, and now we're good to reinstall the spring. There's a little lip you want to get that inside coil over, just like that, and then the bent end goes in the hole there. And then this other end should just fall right into this die cast little notch. That's fairly easy. But there's a trick when you put this internal cover back on. As you can see, you'll match up the bolt holes, but the spring needs to be pushed out. This outer coil of the spring that goes into that cast notch, it needs to get bumped out by this little plastic lip here. You can see how this outer coil sort of rides over that edge right there. That's crucial. Okay, so with this cover in place, the spring is dialed, we can flip this thing back over and fire those bolts in from the right side. We should be safe to reinstall the lever now. If you're planning to put this shifter on a bike right now, install the cable here before you put the cover back on. Give it a few test clicks. Perfect. So now we've successfully upgraded our 11-speed X01, X1, or GX shifter to work for a 12-speed drivetrain. If you're running XX1, stick around. I'll show you how to do a few special steps for that shifter. If not, feel free to skip ahead to the derailleur segment of this video. Now we're going to show you how to upgrade an XX1 shifter from 11-speed to 12-speed using your E13 upgrade kit. What you'll need in terms of tools is the same as for the GX, X01, and X1 shifters. That's a 3mm, 2.5mm, 4mm Allen wrench, and a T25. But you're also going to need an S3 square bit like this. You can use any driver that'll fit a standard hex bit, or you can also actually clamp this bit into a vise, but we'll use the driver for this video. This is included with your kit. You should have everything you need. In terms of parts, you'll need the same spool as in the last video, but with the XX1 ratchet part. Both ratchets fit onto the same spool. And again, you'll have the universal bolt as well. You do not need a washer for this procedure. And the first step is to make sure that our spring is fully relaxed in the shifter, and we will remove the cover. So you've got quick access to the spring in here. There's no inside cover like there was for the lower model shifters. We'll pull this spring right now, set that aside, make sure you keep it clean. Okay, and now what you're gonna do is take the square bit and insert it under the bottom of the shifter here. Now we're really just trying to keep the square bolt steady while we unthread the 4mm pivot bolt out of the top. You'll want to apply pressure from the bottom so that we're just getting the 4mm pivot bolt to back out rather than both things to back out at once and make the whole shifter loosen up. This is a little bit tricky, but if you go slow, you'll get it no problem. Now we're gonna see the stock spool and ratchet sort of come off along with the bolt here, and that's okay because we don't actually need this bolt. We can pull the whole thing off at once and just set it aside. Okay, so now we take the XX1 ratchet pressed onto the E13 spool from the kit, and we're going to put it ratchet side down onto the body of the shifter. Now we will take the pivot bolt from your kit and insert it through the bearing, and we'll tighten that down with our 4mm Allen wrench. And remember, this whole time I've got the S3 square bit into the back of the shifter. Tighten that until it's snug. Okay, so now before installing the spring, we're gonna have to walk the spool manually back to the relaxed position. So we'll hold the shifter like this, and you can use your 3 or 4mm Allen and pull that lever with a finger and just walk it back like that. Okay, so now we know we are in the relaxed position. So now we're good to reinstall the spring. So take the inner bend of the wire and drop it into this square hole right here next to the E13 logo. And then the other end pretty easily fits around this peg. And we're not done yet. It's extremely important that we push the inner coil of this wire underneath this plastic tooth. Shifter won't function right unless you get that in there snug. That is a properly installed spring. And properly greased.
If you're planning to put this shifter on a bike right now, install the cable here before you put the cover back on.
And your XX1 11-speed is now a modified 12-speed shifter. Okay, now we're going to upgrade our 11-speed derailleur and make it 12-speed compatible. All you're going to need for this process is a 3mm Allen wrench and the spacers and bolts provided in your E13 12-speed upgrade kit. As you can see, we have the derailleur pulled completely from the bike, cable is removed, and our first step is going to be pushing the cage forward and locking it in place, like that. This gives us easier access to the pulley bolts. Now we're going to pull the 3mm bolt on the upper pulley. And now when removing the pulley, be careful to not lose the back plate. It's kind of tricky, but if you pull the cage first, you can get them both out clean. And now we're going to replace this front plate. You can tell the difference because the one on the back doesn't have a little lip on it. It's more like a washer. And the lip is actually on the cage itself. And we're going to replace the one that looks most like our spacer. And this one has a little lip on it. We're going to lightly grease the replacement plate before installing. Now we have the pulleys all set up and we can reinstall them. Your E13 kit should come with 2 bolts, one of them longer than the other. We're going to install the lower pulley first using the longer bolt. This doesn't have to be completely tight. We can leave it a little bit loose so it's easier to get the other pulley in. So now I have 2 11-speed derailleurs, one of which has been upgraded and the other one is not. The one on my left, as you can see, doesn't have the spacer. The one on my right, you can see the pulleys are pushed outward a little bit more. This moves the pulleys inboard enough to reach the 12th cog on our 12-speed cassette. Okay, now that you've tightened those pulley bolts to 2 Newton meters, this formerly 11-speed derailleur is now compatible with our 12-speed cassette. Reinstall this along with your newly upgraded shifter, run through all your gearing, make sure everything's working okay, and you should be good to go. Thanks for watching.